Well, it has been another big week of breaking news all over the place, some of it mystifying, so let's demystify it, sort it out with our Powerhouse Roundtable.
We've already started already. We've got a great group with us today, so some introductions. First, Sean Foreman is a professor of political science at Barry University and a reliably moderate voice in the political wars. Pam Keith is a labor lawyer and a U.S. Navy vet. Last year, she ran for Congress as a Democrat in the 18th Congressional District and has also run for the Senate. Marili Cancio is an attorney with her own name firm in Miami, a very influential voice in the Republican Party, state, local, and national. Great to have everyone here. What a great group today. Welcome, first-timer.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Good to see you back at the Roundtable. Let's begin, if we can, with your opinion on this, Pam. And Glenna was there on Friday in a courtroom in Miami-Dade where Judge Nushin's Safety and Miami-Dade Public Defender Carlos Martinez, State Attorney Kathy Rundle got together and with others and began this really remarkable program, and some 20 people got their voting rights back. They had committed felonies and they had not been able to vote. I mean, this is really kind of a breakthrough moment.
It was an incredibly emotional moment for a lot of people like me who participated in trying to get Amendment 4 passed. I was one of those activists, door knockers, and so forth. And the Florida voters spoke so resoundingly at 65 or 7% that they wanted to give people who had committed felonies in the past a second chance once they had paid their debt to society. And as could be expected, and as is typical in Florida, when the legislature doesn't like a referendum, they start to bog it down. They try to legislate it into obscurity. They decide that it needs to be studied or that there needs to be clarifications. And that happened in this case too. And so to see this, the courts kind of taking a proactive role and clearing some of the people so that they can get their voting rights back, it's amazing. But unfortunately, it shouldn't have had to have happened. Amendment 4 should have gone in and just taken effect right away.
I think what the problem is, and I will take politics out of it here. What I see as the issue is the term complete sentence was not really clear because there were many people who thought that the financial components, like restitution, people who still owe restitution are not eligible for this court program because that's a victim's payback. But Marili, speak to, if you will, that when there is a victim of a crime, or even if it's a victimless crime, a court fee or a court cost is usually part of the sentence, and yet that can be mitigated or planned out so that it does not interfere with voting rights, which is what Miami-Dade has done.
I supported Amendment 4. I think it's beautiful. I think it's great that people go back to vote. Unfortunately, people see it as Democrat, Republican, the Democrats are benefiting from this. But if you look at a study done of who the felons are, they're equally divided. I mean, there's also white people, Hispanics, African Americans are benefiting from this. We see here in Miami another problem with court fines or traffic tickets, that people lose their driver licenses, and then that continues accumulating. Is a huge problem. I really thought it was beautiful what happened this week. I fully support it, just like we're taking great steps towards criminal justice reform. The First Step Act signed by President Trump in the White House, I think that's something that it's bipartisan that benefits our society in general.
Yeah. Sean, to the point that Marili just made, there are roughly, we are told, 1.4 million Floridians who had a felony conviction who have not been able to vote. And according to what I have read, roughly half of them are black, and they would vote Democratic. So it's not as if partisan politics isn't playing into this whole discussion.
Well, there's absolutely partisan politics going on. I think this is an interesting civics lesson to see that Florida was different than most of the other states in making it difficult to get your rights restored. We have a statewide referendum, then we have the legislature come back and try to counter it, then it's in the court. So this is a great lesson, and it shows how important this is. But I think that's at the root of it, Michael, that there's a myth that many of these restored felons will register Democrat and vote Democrat, and so Republicans are trying to stop it. But I think Marili made a good point that we just don't know, and really we don't even know how many people ultimately take advantage of getting this right restored, even if they have the opportunity.
I was just going to say that there, Friday at court, there were a number of people who faced the judge, took a minute to get their rights restored, went out and registered to vote, and there were people there to help them do that. So that wasn't so organic. But my question is, how many? I mean, voter turnout was pathetic last week in the local elections. How many of these people that we saw so excited to have that vote back? So I'm thinking they're going to go. How many in general do you think will be able to get their voting rights back and then on election day show up?
You know, I think when you've had that right taken away from you, you value it so much more. And so I think you're going to see a fairly significant number, and it's impossible to predict how many people that is. But the point of the legislature stepping in to encumber Amendment 4 was to create confusion. You're right, Glenna, that the whole point was to have restitution, but restitution of what? If it wasn't even part of your sentence originally, fees and costs in many cases are not part of your original.
No, restitution is wholly
It's
a wholly different.
It's a different
issue.
thing.
Yeah.
And so now you've confused all these people, and all of us who were organizing to go out and register people now pump the brakes and are afraid. And that's precisely what was intended from the the point that you raised, Michael, about partisanship. Is that's the whole point. The point was to slow it down, encumber it, cloud it with uncertainty, and make it less effective.
I disagree on that, Pam, because the problem with these constitutional amendments, I don't like constitutional amendments because it creates such a gray area. That's why it's better, for legislators to do their job and legislate and pass a comprehensive law. And every time that we have one of these constitutional amendments, we have issues, and it's precisely because it leaves the door open to a lot of questions.
Yeah, well,
I was going to say
much
another
better
reason
done
why-
by statute generally
Yeah.
than constitutional amendment.
It's messy because we don't have good records in the 67 different counties in terms of knowing who are the former felons and whether they've tried to register to vote or not.
Or how much money they owe.
Right.
There are not good records on that. throughout the
That's
state.
a very important point, because at least in the Miami-Dade process, for a former felon to go through the Miami-Dade process, that former felon has to proactively initiate the process, go apply, figure out, what the court fees are, and how many of those former felons who might have served time decades ago
Exactly.
even know where to find that. Yeah.
Well, we've got a lot more to talk about with the roundtable. Stick with us. We'll be back in just a minute. We are so glad you are with us this morning for the roundtable. We are with Sean Foreman, Barry University political scientist, Pam Keith, ace attorney, labor lawyer, and sometime candidate, and Marili Cancio, an old friend who, in fact, was a
Ace
candidate,
attorney, sometime
ace
candidate.
attorney, and sometime candidate too. Let's talk about Broward politics, at least briefly. Sean, here we had this week Gregory Tony, appointed by the governor to be the sheriff of Broward in January, and I think on all accounts seems to have done a pretty good job. And this week, he's not really a politician. This week, I thought he gave a pretty good speech saying, here is my platform. I am running for re-election, or running for election. He's never really been elected.
Yeah, when Gregory Tony was appointed by Governor DeSantis, at first I actually thought he was a Republican, being picked by the Republican governor, similar to when Charlie Crist picked Al Lamberti to take over after Jenny went to jail. So to find out that Tony is a Democrat and he's going to run for the first time in his primary, I think it's going to be quite a challenge for him, because Scott Israel ran for that seat 3 times in primaries and general elections and has a base amongst Democratic Party faithful and activists who support him.
But he now has the power of incumbency. He has the ability to do what he's doing right there, get in front of the camera every day. Here's what my department's doing. Here are the changes that I'm making, and really build some knowledge about his capability. That's got to be,
I think
daunting.
that's like one of the reasons why electing sheriffs may not be the greatest idea.
Although it's in the Constitution
I
now.
know, I know, but I think that he's doing a great job for the people in his area, and it's a shame that if voters decide to bring back Israel just because they don't like Sheriff Tony because he was appointed by a Republican, it would be, I think, terrible. I think all the parents from the Parkland victims, all the families, support Sheriff Tony, and
Very vocally.
Yeah, but Pam, to say the obvious, Broward County is the most Democratic county in the state of Florida. And, Sean, you're right. Gregory Tony is a Democrat, but only became registered as a Democrat shortly before he took office.
Right. I think the political dynamic of this is a little bit more subtle than that. We can't ignore that he's African American, and that's going to play a part in all of this. You can't ignore that he was appointed by a Republican, sort of to stick a finger in the eye of very strong Democratic support of Scott Israel. And you can't ignore the dynamics of what happened in Parkland and how people responded to that and the desires of the Parkland families. But in primary politics, and I try to tell people, it's really about being a general with an army. We see this in our presidential. We have all these people who are generals and they have no army, and there's only 4 candidates who really do have an army. In primary politics, you have to have an army. And the question is, where is Sheriff Toney's army right now? Is it the party loyalist and faithful? Is it sort of this new emerging African American or people of color contingency? Or is he going to get support from more centrist and more right-leaning type Democrats? That's the question. Is there an army for him to actually compete with?
And I think it gets really complicated. You see the state senator Radar, who
Kevin Rader.
Kevin
Kevin
Rader.
Rader, who represents that area, who voted to keep Israel in office, even though he was ultimately removed, but yet says, I wouldn't support him. I would support Tony.
You know,
That's
that's
a cop-out. I really think that was a terrible statement by him. I applaud even the person that I ran against, Senator Tadeo, who stood up, gave a great speech, and said why
she voted against it.
And she voted against it. And so it should not be a partisan issue. I think what happened in Parkland was not a partisan issue. We see very vocal parents from both sides that what happened in that tragedy is showed incompetency by the previous sheriff.
So now that you say that, what's really interesting is that the special master who held this hearing decided that there really wasn't enough evidence for that when he sent it to the Senate. The Senate, as a political body, decided to take Sheriff Israel out. I guess the question is, when constituents are watching, no evidence, yes he was, no he wasn't, yes he was, what do they take to the polls? How do they process that?
I think that in this, as in so many things, it's not really going to be about the facts. It's going to be about the coalition and sort of the patronage and that sense of access to power. And we see that. I mean, I'll be honest, I think there's some serious disingenuousness about, we're going to be about competency and we're going to be about this when you see the greater political atmosphere in which this takes place. There are very different standards applied to different politicians depending on the circumstances. I honestly feel that if the court said there wasn't sufficient evidence to remove him, then the consistent argument from this governor or any other governor would be let the people decide. If that is the position of the Republican Party, is to let the people decide, that it should be consistent, and that should have been. But what we see is it's never consistent. It is kind of exactly what works in the moment, and I think that that's what's going to happen in this one too. It's going to be about political coalition more than it is really competition.
Yeah, I still remember the day that Scott Israel came out and said, I've been unfairly removed. It was at a famous black church in Fort Lauderdale, and he was surrounded by a coalition, but mainly African Americans were standing by his side. And I think, Pam, you've raised a really good issue. Will they support an African American incumbent versus somebody who is seen as disposed to like and help the African American community?
And someone that is doing a good job. And I think that's the difference, that it's focusing on policy and training. And so I think that's the difference, in my opinion. A politician or someone from law enforcement that never run before.
There are other candidates. Does anyone else have a chance? Al Pollock is on that list.
And he's raised the second most amount of money. We'll have to see what happens, right? If they're going to have debates and how much the party wants to get involved in this. Mitch Caesar, who's a former Broward Democratic Party leader, is running for clerk of court. So you might have some synergy amongst some candidates trying to pull voters to the polls.
All right, well, we're going to take a break. We're going to come back, and I think we might get to Michael Bloomberg in a minute.
Is he here?
Unfortunately not.
Yet another Florida angle headed to D.C. Looks like former Attorney General Pam Bondi has been taken up to Washington on Team Trump to defend the president against coming impeachment inquiry. Marili, Pam Bondi is one of the first and most vocal of the president's supporters. Is she going? What's her position? Will she help the effort? What's going on?
I love Pam Bondi. She did a great job for Florida's Attorney General for 8 years. Now she's been working as a lobbyist since January for the Ballard firm. I think she needs to clear some conflicts.
With foreign clients.
Correct, but
Yes.
one has to do with human trafficking, for example. She'll be great. I think that's what the president needs, someone that is close to him, that he can trust, and is a temporary position. And
Yeah.
Pam will be great.
Yeah, but Sean, I'm still unclear about what she is going to do. The White House simply said she's going to come on the side for communications. I mean, is she going to be an attack dog and defend Trump in the impeachment inquiry, or is she going to be issuing legal opinions?
Well, I
don't
think that's
know.
what we're waiting to see. Previously, they had talked about former Congressman Trey Gowdy of South Carolina taking
Yeah.
on this particular role, and they couldn't come to an agreement. So I think that's a good question. Will she be on the legal team, or will she be on TV all the time? And I think that's the role that they're looking at. She'll be the face of defending the president. And, frankly, some of these things are going to be hard to defend on television. She might have to stretch some of the explanations, and I feel that there's going to be some backlash against her for taking on this role.
Explain that a little bit. Stretch what explanations and what kind of backlash?
Oh, well, now we're getting into the whole impeachment investigation, and what do we mean by quid pro quo, and did bribery happen on that call? And so we're going to see this debated over the next 2 months. And I think, those who are trying to defend some of the president's actions are having a harder time explaining them.
Right.
I want to, excuse me, Pam, I want to put up on the screen some really interesting poll numbers that came out on Friday on impeaching and removing the president. Here's what Floridians said in a University of North Florida poll. 46% of people support impeaching and removing the president. 48% oppose, 6% don't know. And Pam Keith, it seems to me, this is just sort of symbolic of the division in the state of Florida.
I think it's actually more symbolic of the effectiveness of Mr. Trump's defenders in confusing and obfuscating what we're really talking about. I mean, I don't think there's a Republican, independent, left, right, or progressive in this state who would agree that it would have been okay for Ron DeSantis to use the governorship to extort this television station into making up lies against Ron DeSantis' future opponent. Everybody in this state would know that that's wrong. That's not what governors are supposed to do. That's not what senators are supposed to do. That's not what presidents are supposed to do.
And that is not what he's doing, Pam. And I think that's why we're going to see public hearings coming out this week. And I hope that they have in-depth hearings of what's happening, not have witnesses chosen by Adam Schiff of who's going to be able to testify on behalf of the Republicans. So I think what voters want, or the American people want, is transparency. The more transparent that the president is, releasing the transcript, releasing the second transcript, the better it is. And when you have Adam Schiff being the person that spoke with the whistleblower, that wanted to put the whistleblower to speak, now no longer wanting the whistleblower to testify, the American people, they don't like that.
I think that is a really generous read. First of all, there is no entity more less transparent than this administration, blocking witnesses and subpoenas and not cooperating in any way. The reason the whistleblower is being protected is because attack dogs from the right are threatening him and his family. It's a stochastic, terroristic thing that is happening from the right. And more importantly, the only witnesses that are relevant are the ones that are germane to the crime that's being investigated. Having somebody that's totally irrelevant to that, just so that you can muck up the works and make it look like you're doing something, is not right for the American people.
Well,
there's no question there was a quid
I
pro
think
quo.
calling Hunter Biden to come testify
is not germane to what
person-
Trump did.
Absolutely, he's being accused of corruption. So I think we would all agree that if the president says to any other country, investigate corruption in your country, we're not going to give you any money. I think we would all be in agreement. But just because that
In
person has a
agreement about what? Agreement that would be okay?
Yes, investigating corruption. Wouldn't you want to have our president say
I mean,
to another
hold
country?
up
No, that's
millions
ridiculous.
of dollars of tax money for military aid for a country that's under attack by Russia. That it's
We've done
okay
more for
to-
that country than any other country.
not my
And in that
question.
conversation, in that transcript, that's what they were talking about. And I tell everybody, read the 5-page transcript, because people just hear little bits and pieces and they're not hearing exactly what they're talking about in that conversation.
Right, and the problem is that that transcript is not even a transcript. It is a sanitized summary put out by the White House to make it look as good as possible.
Colonel Vindman, in fact, that was his
And
objection.
and we have so
welcome-
much testimony that filled in those blanks that the GOP is trying to keep away
Well, I
from
didn't
the
hear
people.
anything because it was in the basement. So I hope that it comes out to the public here.
It's going
so
to
that we
come
can
out.
see
We're going to
it.
have live hearings, and I have popcorn. I'm ready for it.
And
So
so
a
this is
couple-
what I mean when I say Pam Bondi. It may have some baggage because we're going to see
gonna be real problematic.
this at the national level happening with
And
spokespeople.
let
of
me
each
just
party.
point out we have less than a minute, and just want to throw out there, since Michael did a great big tease, Sean, this one's for you. Michael Bloomberg, maybe in the race, already on the filed in Alabama. What does that do, if anything, to the Democratic primary field?
I'm not sure. I don't know why he gets in this late, where his base is. People have been running, have been in the states. They have positions that are more likable. It makes more sense for me, for him to wait and try to get on the stage as an independent versus Trump and the Democrat.
Right.
So he's not going to do well in Iowa and New Hampshire. We'll see
Well,
where
he's
this
not
goes.
even going to run in those states.
I think it just shows that they're afraid that Trump is going to win, that there's nobody in the field right now that can beat him.
I
All
think.
right,
I think.
that's, we are out of
This
time.
is how
I beg
TV
your
works.
pardon.
Time's up. Time's up.
But thank you all. Great
Great
roundtable.
roundtable.
We appreciate
Great
it.
to have you here.